This is a dissection video of the sheep brain. You'll be asked to watch the video and answer questions periodically throughout this video.
Here's the sheep brain with the meninges still attached. The meninges consist of three membranous layers that surround the brain and spinal cord. The inner layer is the pia mater, the middle layer is the arachnoid, and the thick white encasement seen here is the outermost layer, called the dura mater. To remove the meninges, I like to cut around these ventral structures because otherwise they're easily pulled off with the meninges. Taking a look at the dorsal surface of the sheep brain, we can see the cerebrum. The cerebrum is covered with convolutions, elevations, called gyri. Separated by shallow depressions called sulci. The cerebrum is divided in half by the longitudinal fissure. Into the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. The cerebral hemispheres make up over 80% of the brain. The activities of the right and left cerebral hemispheres are specialized for different functions, making them unique from each other. The cerebrum is separated from the cerebellum by the transverse fissure. As I mentioned, this is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is involved in motor coordination and balance. The surface of the cerebellum has narrow folds called the folia cerebelli. This is the spinal cord. Looking into the transverse fissure, we can look right on the dorsal surface of the midbrain, and you'll notice 4 bumps. This is known as the corpora quadrigemina. It's made up of 2 superior colliculi and the 2 inferior colliculi. If we look just above the corpora quadrigemina, we see the pineal body. The pineal body is part of the diencephalon. In this video, I'd like to examine the brainstem in a few different views. Let's start with the ventral surface, where we can see all 3 parts of the brainstem. This is the midbrain. The pons. And the medulla oblongata, also known as the medulla. Let's look into the transverse fissure, which is in between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. These 4 bumps make up the dorsal surface of the midbrain. This area is called the corpora quadrigemina. The corpora quadrigemina is made up of the 2 superior colliculi, which are visual reflex centers, and the two inferior colliculi that relay auditory information to the sensory cortex and are involved in reflexive responses to sound. Lastly, let's take a look at the brainstem in a mid-sagittal section. Here's the transverse fissure, and just anterior to the transverse fissure is the superior portion of the brainstem, a region called the midbrain. We can see a superior colliculus, here's the cerebral aqueduct, which is contained within the midbrain. Here is a cerebral peduncle, which means little foot of the cerebrum. Inferior to the midbrain is pons. The pons contains two-way conduction tracts connecting higher brain centers to the spinal cord. Here is the medulla, which is the most inferior part of the brainstem. This region regulates basic life functions, such as heart rate and respiration. The medulla is continuous with the spinal cord. To make a frontal section, what we want to do is make an incision to divide the brain into an anterior half and a posterior half. Taking a look at the frontal section, we can see the gray matter that makes up the cerebral cortex. Gray matter consists mainly of neuron cell bodies. Right underneath, we can see the white matter, which is predominantly myelinated axons. Here's the longitudinal fissure, which divides the right and left cerebral hemispheres. This is the corpus callosum, connecting the right cerebral hemisphere to the left. And right underneath that are the lateral ventricles, which are separated by the membrane, the septum pellucidum. This is the fornix. This is the third ventricle. This region is the thalamus, which is part of the diencephalon. To make a mid-sagittal section, what we want to do is cut right down the longitudinal fissure and divide the brain on midline into two separate halves. Let's take a look at the mid-sagittal section of the sheep brain. We can see the cerebrum, and this white structure is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a commissure. It consists of myelinated axons that connect the right and left cerebral hemispheres. Right below the corpus callosum is a lateral ventricle. There's a lateral ventricle on the right and on the left. They're lined with ependymal cells that circulate the cerebrospinal fluid found inside of them. This central region of the brain is called the thalamus. Right below the thalamus, this region is called the hypothalamus. This is the optic chiasm, where some of the right and left optic nerve fibers cross midline. This round structure is the mammillary body, which is involved in the transmission of olfactory information. Here is the pituitary gland. This is the pineal body, which secretes one hormone, melatonin. Here we can see the transverse fissure that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And moving through the transverse fissure, we look right onto the dorsal surface of the midbrain. This projection is called the superior colliculus. It's part of the corpora quadrigemina. Taking a look at the anterior portion of the midbrain, this region is a cerebral peduncle. Just inferior to that is a region called the pons. And just inferior to pons is the medulla oblongata. This is the cerebellum. And you can see the white branching arbor vitae contained within the cerebellum. The fourth ventricle is right next to the cerebellum. The pons and the medulla make up the ventral wall of the fourth ventricle. We can see how it continues down the spinal cord as the central canal. Let's take a look at the ventral surface of the sheep brain. This is the inferior surface of the sheep brain. These are the olfactory bulbs. The optic nerves. The optic nerves originate on the back of the eyeballs and carry visual information into the brain. Some of the optic nerve fibers cross midline at the optic chiasm and then continue on into the brain through the optic tracts. This is the pituitary gland. It consists of two lobes that secrete hormones. Some of those hormones have direct effects in the body, and some serve to regulate other endocrine organs. The pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus by a stalk called the infundibulum. Posterior to the pituitary is this white elevated region. That's the mammillary body. Moving on into the brainstem, this is the anterior part of the midbrain, a region called the cerebral peduncles, which means little feet of the cerebrum. This is the pons, which contains conduction tracts that connect higher brain centers and the spinal cord. This is the medulla, an area vital to basic life functions. The brainstem is continuous with the spinal cord. Let's take a look at the ventricles inside of the sheep brain. The ventricles are cavities within the brain that are interconnected. They're lined with ciliated ependymal cells, which circulate cerebrospinal fluid. Right underneath the corpus callosum, we find The lateral ventricle. There are two lateral ventricles, one on the right and one on the left. The lateral ventricles are separated at midline by a membrane called the septum pellucidum. This region is the third ventricle. You'll notice some pink feathery tissue. This is called the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is a vascular tissue covered with ependymal cells that produces cerebrospinal fluid. The choroid plexus is found in all of the ventricles. The fourth ventricle is just anterior to the cerebellum. The medulla and pons form the ventral wall of the fourth ventricle. We can see where the fourth ventricle is leading into the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct is contained within the midbrain. The cerebral aqueduct connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. And we can also see how the fourth ventricle continues on as the central canal in the spinal cord.
This ends the sheep brain dissection activity.